We are incredibly privileged to live in an era with free access to precious commodities. We have to only as much as stand up, walk towards the sink and turn on the tap to get water. If we're cold, we just have to turn on the heater. We have access to education, to books about anything we can imagine. Lift as much as a single finger and an infinity of information shows up right in front of your eyes with one click. Music, films, art, poetry. 1 second and it's all in our room without us having to go anywhere. And if we want to go see it in person, we can. We can choose the job we want at free will, or we can create something new. There is no limit to what we can do. And if we fail, and we certainly will, we can try again. Even if we're deprived, it's all there. It's become the norm in the society. Despite all that's still wrong with the world, there's so much that's been improved. Why aren't we amazed at all that's available to us, the greatness we're born into? Where has the memory of the disasters of the 20th century gone? Why are us, mainly young people, wallowing in depression and despair more than ever before? I remember reading a short story in the YouTube comments section once. It was Thanksgiving and everyone was sitting at the table and plates with dishes were being brought in. When it was all prepared, it was time to say our thanks. Once my turn came, I stood up and said, "I am grateful for the sewer system." Silence followed and everyone looked at me as if I was a freak. Well now, take a moment and imagine how different our lives would be without such a seemingly basic thing as the sewer system. Certainly more impaired than with a lack of chocolate or iPads. Now, how often are we encouraged to be grateful for all that we have achieved as a society? Certainly not as often as we're being told that humans are a cancer to be eradicated, except for the minorities of course, or that it's our future generations that'll be a burden for the planet Earth, and therefore children shouldn't be begot as much anymore. Or that inequality is perpetuated by the patriarchy and the white people. Not racist at all. We're being harried by catastrophic scenarios from all sides, and guilt is being greedily absorbed by the young, naive soul. That is the plague of the modern era, and a danger for the future. A recipe for useless, easy to manipulate masses of uneducated, self-blaming, virtue-signaling TikTok cuckoos. Because victimhood is more alluring than responsibility, but only for a while. Or perhaps to maintain a veneer of virtue is less expensive than daily maintenance of morality.
As a white woman, aware of my own privilege in this country, I am so angry. And I can't even begin. Forgive me.
Or maybe the reason why all this is happening is that which goes on and on in the heads of a great many youngsters. I don't know what to do. Education, a prelude to doom. It all begins with education, or a lack of thereof. Where the education system fails, the task to educate ourselves falls onto us. And we fail heavily, and no wonder. Can we set up a valley out of nowhere and tell ourselves not to be bored? No, just like we can't simply choose whom to fall in love with. Academic, religious, social education, they all should spring from and back up the same foundation, morality. But the academic is poisoned by the political, the religious rejected by the scientific, and the social invaded by a subjective, anarchistic spirit of setting things right at all cost. Morality yells and kicks and screams to be heard amidst the waves of a biblical flood of political correctness, hopelessness, superficiality, and debris of fake virtue. And the young generation call this home. To call things by their name, young people hunger for a purpose. And that is what lurks behind the suffering in silence or revolting and maddening ruckus. In either case, whether it's an ideal of social justice or clinical depression, it's that itching void within that yearns to be filled with something other than debris whose meaning is relative. What I'm trying to say is that we are thrown into the world as a tool for purposes of others, but we are shy to become a tool for ourselves because we believe we'd crumble under that weight of responsibility. And it's frightening and uncomfortable to even try. It's then easier to follow the lead that portrays us in a good light, even if it's devoid of meaning or self-destructive. Universities and colleges in the West have become ivory towers for indoctrination of the young idealists and for perpetuation of the feelings of a useless existence. We want to set things right, but out there, the world is rotten, and that's why everything's wrong with us, after all, or so we are told. And so, instead of waging war with our vices, we wage war with life itself. Eradicate suffering completely, obliterate it, that's the goal, and for that we sacrifice even common sense. Vanish, oh science, because you don't care about my feelings, and that's what matters first and foremost. But our teachers forget to tell us the fundamental truth, that life is suffering. Communists wanted to conjure up a life of equal quality for everyone. Bliss and utopia, yes. Not only did they not succeed, but they did in more than 50 million people in the process. And yet a hammer and a sickle on protests make us laugh, or worse, show our support. But if it were a swastika, we'd be horrified. How alluring it sounds in theory, but imagine if life had such qualities that would have allowed it to be implemented into society. Although it failed multiple times in history, try to imagine it. Would become nothing but robots, orderly machines operating by the laws laid out by mathematical formulas, mere piano keys to be played, as Dostoevsky smartly pointed out in Notes from Underground. And so, I'd venture as far out as to say that suffering is actually needed. And that crucial thing they never tell us is that yes, there is this suffering, but you have the strength to carry it. Maybe the world won't be to your liking and others will hurt you, but you can grow a thicker skin and stand up to it all. Maybe you should share your opinion out loud even if you fear the other's disapproval, or pick up that brush and paint even if there are thousands of painters who are better than you. They all began somewhere. Or learn to speak 5 languages even if it takes years. Yes, you have to work very hard, and yes, you will fail so many times, but when the time to suffer comes, you can choose to face it with dignity, or blame the system, the people, or even the God himself, but it won't change a thing. Us young people dream of freedom, but the truth is that all we need is rules to keep us on the path of civilized freedom leading towards a goal. It's not the attainment of the goal per se that's thrilling, but the journey itself is what makes us feel alive. We simply don't realize that we have the strength to carry that weight, that it's better than float in our tears. Who can orient himself somewhere where everything is relative after all? Ironically, we hate responsibility, but that's what sets us free. We are human beings, parts of a greater organism, the society. We as individuals aren't that unique as we like to think after all. But we can shape ourselves into something useless, idle and pathetic, or something purposeful. And I think we all know which one feels better. So no, it's not inclusivity, diversity and equity that fills up that terrifying void within. We already have the equality of opportunity. It's right there for us to grab it. I'm not saying abandonment of the issues we face as a society is what should be done, but how can the famished and impoverished feed and provide for the world? We are young and unexperienced, privileged by the fruits of thousands of years of shaping, building, discovering, understanding, explaining, trying, failing, destroying, abandoning, figuring out. And ours is the mission to keep alive what works and improve what doesn't. But we first must garner skills to be able to discern which is which. What greater way to make the world a better place than to shape ourselves into a sophisticated and educated being with a purpose larger than himself? Mental health crisis and psychoanalysis. Let's now look at some stats regarding mental health and young people, along with a psychoanalytical outlook on what's happening in a young person's soul. In England, in 2017, 1 in 9 children ages 5 to 16 were identified as having a probable mental disorder. In 2020, it became 1 in 6. Such an increase in only 3 years' time doesn't sound very good. Worldwide, suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death for young people ages 15 to 24. According to a report released by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, in the US, the suicide rate among those aged 10 to 24 increased nearly 60% between 2007 and 2018. Young people undergo significant developmental changes, both physically and mentally, which affect their behavior and lead to, for example, over-emotionality or excessive risk-taking. My take on the current widespread psychopathology, however, is that young people find it increasingly harder to undergo the process of individuation, that is, emergence from the dream of childhood into the reality of being an adult, which is maximized by the lack of positive role models, and so instead of embracing it, resist it willfully. We want to remain in the land of pluripotentiality, because to grow up means to sacrifice all that we could be for one thing we'll choose to be. But if we refuse to become something, we will remain nothing at all. We won't avoid making sacrifices in any case, and as a bonus, we'll develop into resentful adults if we refuse to mature. Jung perfectly describes this struggle in his essay The Stages of Life. Quote, "Something in us wishes to remain a child, to be unconscious or, at most, conscious only of the ego, to reject everything strange, or else subject it to our will, to do nothing, or else indulge our own craving for pleasure or power." In his book Modern Man in Search of a Soul, he writes, quote, "Just as the youthful neurotic is afraid of life, so the older one shrinks back from death." End quote. Now that we've established that more often than not, young people are floating in the purpose void, the question that arises is, where did this wave come from? To answer that, we have to return to the beginning again, education. The mindset that people develop affects the system, which in turn affects the next generations. And so the cycle continues. Resentful ideologues holding positions in academia, propagating the idea of unrestrained freedom and radical change, along with the ideology of overt positivity, built on the idea of "don't worry, be happy," that construed happiness as the ultimate goal, have collaborated and created a beautiful lie that's filling young people with expectations and the older with ennui. These romantic ideas clash with reality as the process of growing up is ushered in, and the young soul crumbles under the pressure. Young people are being overly protected from the true nature of reality, just like the Sleeping Beauty, but so much that she never even leaves the castle and thus never meets the prince. The overwhelming wheel of life doesn't even prick her. She as much as sees it and rushes back into her bed. There are of course adversities which affect us we cannot directly influence, such as cycles of recession, loss of a loved one, or a tornado ruining our recently built house. But that's how it's always been. When the roots are strong, the tree survives when strong wind comes. But when the roots are rotten, it may even collapse under its own weight. The core of the young people's plight is the lack of coping strategies and a victimized outlook on the adversities of the world. In psychotherapy, the most efficient way to treat anxiety disorders is exposure therapy. The patient has to face what he fears in order to overcome it. What actually happens is that the patient gradually learns to regain confidence in himself and retake responsibility for his life after an unprecedented, unbearable event, such as trauma or abuse, severed the connection between his self and life. Understanding where we came from as humanity and individuals and have clear where we are going helps buttress the self to confront the contingencies of life. Local pleasure and technology. Youth wasted online. According to American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, surveys show that 90% of teens aged 13 to 17 have used social media at some point in their lives. 75% report having at least one active social media profile, and 51% report visiting a social media site at least daily. Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reported in 2015 that 94.8% of 15-year-olds in the UK used social media sites before or after school. For some specific examples, let's look at TikTok. The vast majority of TikTok users are aged between 10 and 19. In the US, almost 70% of teens have used TikTok at some point. Why is social media so widespread amongst youngsters? First and foremost, it's the source of instant gratification and never-ending novelty. It engages the corticostriatal dopaminergic system and thus brings quick satisfaction and slowly cultivates addiction, for which we find ourselves returning to it. And it might also be related to why young people give up so quickly. A study found that, quote, high levels of internet usage and heavy media multitasking are associated with decreased grey matter in prefrontal regions associated with maintaining goals in face of distraction. End quote. There are studies that link frequency of social media use to poorer mental health, mainly to higher depression rate, but some studies also found a link with positive well-being. The outcomes were dependent on motivation for using social media. Therefore, if it's used for productive or educative purposes, then yes, social media and internet in general can be a great platform. But the ego inflates like a balloon on platforms where skills and knowledge, results of hard work, matter not, or where utopistic desire of having to do nothing but getting everything outlays itself and is being fed perpetually. And that's why it's so attractive and pernicious to young people. What's problematic about social media is therefore the fact that so many young people waste away in the modern, unreal Neverland only to keep consuming and perpetuating a mode of living of hopelessness and uselessness while cultivating oversensitivity. This then contributes to censorship online and at universities, where matters are labelled and open debates treated as triggering. Will young people eventually shun the truth or rewrite parts of history if they find it triggering? How can a hero exist without facing the dark and terrible? Appeal of liberalism. Now that we've established where the crisis stems from, let's look at why liberal ideas are so appealing to young people and why it might be problematic. I'd say the reason is rather self-evident. People with a mindset constructed on a set of ideas founded on arbitrariness, combined with a desire for freedom and happiness, characteristic of the young and adventurous spirit, are easily swayed by that which seems to pervade fulfillment of these desires. Indeed, our infantile id, the subconscious sea of impulses and yearnings, revels in this notion. While empathy and no-harm ethics is a great idea, it doesn't work in and on itself only. A certain level of aggression is required so that one doesn't end up being trampled upon. It's necessary to integrate both morality and aggression into the consciousness. What's happening instead is that the latter is either repressed as something unacceptable, or what is rather frequent amongst social justice warriors, unsuccessfully integrated and acting up from behind a veneer of virtue. Combined with a lack of awareness about historical events, socio-political situation, and human psychology, bringing up younger generations by this agency is a recipe for disaster. Without the drive to question everything, young people are ending up severely undereducated. Almost 50% of 17-year-old Americans have no idea who Stalin was, and yet the same people yell for the return of socialism and dismantling of capitalism, and that without the knowledge of even the basic principles of these systems. Attempts to change the structures one doesn't know enough about, under the pretense of establishment of equality, may lead to the very opposite. And we've already seen this happen, for example, with the discriminatory 50% men, 50% women policy, or the so-called cancel culture. Although this doesn't concern young people only, the future is in their hands. The underlying purpose void of young people may not be utterly atypical, but the rate at which we are becoming unable to cope with it is becoming alarming. The tentacles of this terrible kraken are slowly planting ticking bombs in all the areas of the society. But not all is lost. If you're young, do the best you can to take the opportunities you have to educate yourself and integrate yourself into the society. And if you're older, do the best you can to support this effort of the young. We really need it.